Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series for this semester and academic year. I'm Maryn McKenna. I'm a journalist and author and senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University. And I'm the curator of this series, which makes me your host as we undertake our latest set of author conversations. In a moment, I'll introduce you to my guest, Starre Julia Vartan, a journalist and author of the really fascinating new book, The Stronger Sex: What Science Tells Us About the Power of the Female Body. But first, let me tell you about this series. At least once per month during the academic year, we invite writers whose journalistic or academic books examine health, the science and history of health, or health's intersection with society. This series of conversations is sponsored by Emory's Center for the Study of Human Health, along with an array of fantastic co-sponsors whom we are so grateful for. This autumn, those are the Georgia Center for the Book, which is a local affiliate of the Library of Congress that stages very frequent public conversations with authors, illustrators, poets, and others to bring the news of new books to the public. And Emory's Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement, which creates opportunities for faculty, staff, and students to share ideas with local and global audiences. And Ideas Festival Emory, which launched a year ago on Emory's Oxford campus and returns this month with an amazing lineup of speakers. So let me tell you who else appears in this series this fall, which is live streamed on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, and archived on YouTube, and has been for a full 5 years of conversations. The authors appearing this semester are tonight, Starre Vartan, with The Stronger Sex, which was published in July by Seal Press at Hachette Books. Last month, we heard from Jenny Erin Smith with Valley of Forgetting: Alzheimer's Families and the Search for a Cure, which was published in April by Riverhead. And next month, I'll talk to Iram Alam with The Care of Foreigners: How Immigrant Physicians Changed U.S. Healthcare, which was just published by Johns Hopkins University Press. One final note, this is a live event, and you can interact with us. We encourage you to do that. If you want to ask a question, please comment on any of the platforms where you are watching us, and our producer, Stefan Kaplan of Spin It Social, will make sure we see what you've said. Do note that I'll turn to your questions in the second half of this hour-long live stream, but you can put your comments in at any time and we will catch up to them. Now, let's turn to our book and guest. Starre Vartan is a science journalist and investigative reporter who earned 2 bachelor's degrees in geology and in English, and a Master's of Fine Arts in nonfiction at Columbia University. Her journalism has been widely published: National Geographic, Scientific American, The Washington Post, New Scientist, many other publications. She's also an essayist and writer of short fiction. The Stronger Sex is her second book, and it's being published not just here in North America, but in the United Kingdom, in Australia, where she lives part-time, in New Zealand, China, and Korea. Starre, welcome to this series.
Thank you so much for having me, Maryn.
So I always start by asking authors to introduce themselves to the watching, listening audience and kind of describing what their path was to the book that we're going to be exploring. So tell us about you, about your career to this point that brought you to write this.
I've had a very non-traditional, not straightforward career. I started my career as a scientist. I was a hydrologist in Connecticut and went through hazmat training and the whole nine, and really expected that to be the work that I would do and got really interested very quickly in environmental reporting, and wrote some feature articles for a local alt weekly back when we had such papers that were printed on newspaper stock, and then took a turn in the mid 2000s when the internet and blogging got really exciting. And I saw that as just such a fun opportunity, and sort of hadn't seen a place for blogging about women's specific issues. So that was of early interest to me because I was raised by my grandmother, kind of a single parent. I did get a lot of support from my dad, but he was actually here in Australia. And my grandmother taught me a lot about growing up and being a strong woman. And we can get more into that later, but she always inspired my work. And so in the mid 2000s, I became a blogger and a very, very, very early influencer. And I was on all the social media sites when that first started, and it was new and exciting and not so demoralizing. So that was a little bit of a U-turn, but it was tremendous fun. And I really got that daily reporting chops, not at a newspaper, but in the blogging arena, and focused on sustainability and environmental health stories that affected women. And since I then went to grad school and started really going back towards more deeply scientific reporting, where my career is now. So I'm a full-time science journalist and have refocused on women's health, but I used to write a lot about animals and environmental stories too, which are great fun and also slightly depressing, but also beautiful and amazing. The world is gorgeous. So I feel very lucky in my career.
So one of the things that I think is really intriguing in the beginning of the book, and it's actually sort of sprinkled throughout it, is that you give us bits and pieces of your own raising with your grandmother, which I think, if I'm understanding correctly, that was in New York State.
Yes, in the Hudson Valley. She raised me. We were just about an hour from New York City, but on a dead end of a dirt road. So really back in the woods. It felt very special and homey, and it was a property that needed a lot of attention. And my grandmother was old school. She thought kids were definitely able to do work, and as soon as I was taught to do work, I did it. And somewhat age appropriately, but she would also assign me chores. And the case was that I was very like every kid, excited to watch TV or read books or run around in the woods with my dogs and do other things than my chores. But I had a list of chores, and if they didn't get done, I would be in trouble. So those chores would oftentimes be hurried through, or I would try to hurry through them. And they would include things like piling large stacks of wood, moving stones around. We had a lot of stone walls on our property, digging holes for various garden projects, that kind of thing. And when you're a kid and you try to rush through things, you really end up testing your strength. So I would overpile the wheelbarrow with wood, and I would, try to get it all the way to the wood pile, and sometimes it would fall over and I would have to restack it. And so those early years when I was 7, 8, 9, pushing the mower up the hill, I really had to learn the limits of my own strength. And this was very independently, without any, even my grandmother telling me this is what you can and can't do physically. I figured it out for myself. And that was really the genesis of this book.
So there's a really interesting tension in the beginning of the book where you're sort of setting out the argument and the path that you're going to follow in leading us through this exploration of what science has said and now is saying about the conditions of women's bodies. That what the messages you got as you grew older and sort of entered into the culture about women's strength or lack of it, women's physical place in the world, didn't match what you yourself had experienced as you were growing up. As you say, stacking logs, hauling rocks, digging wells. You were expressing yourself as a strong physical being, and then you ran into these messages that said, well, actually, no, you're not.
Yeah, it was a really strange experience for me. As a kid, I would, went to summer camp, I would be at school, and people would always tell me, oh, ask a boy in my class. Oftentimes, girls grow faster than boys up until 6th, 7th grade. So it would be a person smaller than me, or ask a man, or ask someone else to help you do something really simple like carry chairs. And I knew what I did at home, and the things, I did on my property, moving rocks around. And I was just like, why would I need help carrying a chair? That it just was such a strange message. Because, and when you're a kid, you're learning these messages, right? You're thinking, oh, okay, well, I know what I can do, but then somebody's telling me that I shouldn't. And so that really stuck with me. And I almost felt throughout my childhood like I had to hide my strength.
Mm.
And I'm a medium-sized person. I'm a pretty, I would say was fairly in the middle of the cohort of the, small town of girls that I grew up in. So I don't know that this was an unusual experience, or if I just had a more heightened experience of that because my grandmother made me do so much work.
So what's fascinating to me about the book is the way the narrative sort of keeps turning back on itself, that you start out as this very strong young person, and then you run into these cultural messages that maybe you're not supposed to be strong, that maybe that's one of the things that doesn't define women is strength. But then when you embark on this exploration of what science now actually has to say about the condition of being in a female body, you found out that a lot of these things that you'd been told actually weren't true.
Exactly. Yeah, my own bodily experience growing up sort of told me from a young age these things weren't true, but of course you grow up, you accept some of this information as you move through the world. I moved through my career, and it always sat on my shoulders though. It was always kind of just right behind me. And I got the opportunity to write a feature story for a publication that still I think sort of exists, Medium. At one point, they were very excited to pay and have incredible science journalism, and so I wrote this piece that was just like looking at four aspects of female bodily strength. And when I was researching that, this sort of idea that I always had led to the feature article. But when I was researching it, I realized there's an incredible world of information out there, and something you hear as a journalist a lot of times is this idea that you have a very long magazine article, or
Mm.
is this a book? And oftentimes the answer is it's a really long magazine article. And so that's what you should write. A book, really, you need to have enough. Um, and when I was writing this feature article, I realized there was more than enough for a book here. And that I was so passionate about writing it because finding this information as it came across my desk, just researching for an article, which I spent way too much time on because I kept finding all of this incredible science, then made me realize there's a much larger project here. And second part of that being, there was a wonderful response to the article when it came out. I was expecting a lot of mean comments online. I've been on the internet since like late 2002, and I got a few little snarky comments, but it was mostly so much excitement and positivity from lots of women, but also plenty of men too. Men who had daughters, who were athletes, men who were coaches, men who were just interested in sports and the sports and athletics world, saying, this is what I've seen too in my own experience, actually out there doing sports or hanging out with my daughter or whatever. So that between my own excitement in the science and knowing there was enough, and then the response, I started putting together a book proposal.
So let's talk about some of that science. It was really interesting to me to read that the emerging science of differences between male and female bodies, we'll get to the sex and gender distinction in a minute, is that they are in fact different, as multiple people have said at this point in the scientific literature. We should not just consider that women are small men, that they have differences, but in some cases those differences mean that women actually have strengths or abilities that are greater than men's, that are different, but that equip them for life in the world in a completely different way. And I would love to just hear you talk about some of those.
Yeah. So the thesis for the book really is that men have defined what strength is based on what their bodies tend to do well. and, important caveat here, we're talking population scale differences, not individual differences. So we all know men who are really good at some of the things that I'm going to talk about as generally more female strengths, and vice versa, women who have tremendous upper body strength, etc. But over populations, men tend to have wonderful explosive strength, being able to lift that heavy weight a few times above their head, or sprint a fast mile or half mile. These are wonderful strengths, and this is not to take anything away from those. However, those are not the only strengths of the human body. And right now, the way we've defined, and the way the patriarchal history in science, and also science history, has defined what strength is based on what those bodies tend to do best. There are so many strengths that I couldn't actually even encompass all of them in this book, but I highlighted the ones that I thought were the most interesting. And they include, of course, longevity, which we all know women live longer than men all around the world. Women outsurvive men through diseases and famines and stressful situations. They also outsurvive men in every stage of life, even considering women go through childbearing, pregnancy, etc., which, depending on the time and place, can be extremely physically risky. Even when you look at babies, little baby girls in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care units, are known to outsurvive those baby boys. And that makes sense if you think about, some kind of evolutionary advantage to having more females than males. So that's an obvious one. The roots of where that longevity comes from are really interesting. Do we have some cultural impacts to that? Of course. Men tend to do riskier jobs. It's worth mentioning they usually keep women out of those risky jobs, even if women want to do them. But they do have a higher proportion of those risky jobs. They also choose riskier behaviors. They tend to do things like ride motorcycles and drink and smoke and do drugs more often. So there are cultural impacts as to why women live longer, but there's a lot of deep physical strengths as to why women live longer as well. So getting into sort of the non-sporty side of the book, there are deep immune differences. There's both XX advantages to female immunity, where we have more of the types of cells that patrol the body to keep pathogens out from the get-go. So these are your basic defenders of the body, all the way up to the types of cells that remember past infections and are able to fight them off more effectively. So actually, in most cases, vaccines are more effective in female bodies because of those memory B cells that will remember past infections, remember that vaccination, and then be able to protect the body going forward. So there's also hormonal aspects to women's immunity strength. And so estrogen is just an amazing, powerful hormone. And so during the time that women are experiencing that estrogen from menarche to menopause, there's another additional boost in immunity as well. And we see this in all kinds of tests across the lifespan, especially in that period. Women outlive men, and immunity-wise outperform them at all stages of life, but especially in that reproductive zone. And so we know that estrogen has a part in that as well. And interestingly, not just does estrogen boost female immunity, but testosterone actually decreases male immunity as well. And more testosterone means less immunity. And it's a trade-off for the male. And we see this across mammal species, this estrogen and testosterone effect. So this is not just human beings. This is really well documented.
But to bring this back to humans.
Exactly.
So the thing that's fascinating to me about this. So first, let me just chase this down. You mentioned menarche. One of the points you make in the book that I had never thought of is that prior to puberty, in terms of abilities, young boys and young girls are identical. They might have different growth rates, but for instance, their sports performance on a field is going to be very similar. Their grip strength, propulsive strength, and so forth, that those don't really begin to diverge or differentiate, let's say, until a certain point in the lifespan. Did I get that right?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. It's fascinating. So when you get into looking at sports science, which is where a lot of the information about the differences in bodies comes from, with the caveat that only 6% of sports science has ever focused on female bodies.
Oof. 6.
So there's a lot more to learn, putting it lightly. But the early childhood stuff is really interesting. We do see differences in ability between little boys and little girls in terms of throwing and skipping and precision and balance and all of those kinds of things. So if you're thinking, well, I look around at kids and I see the little boys better at throwing balls. Yep, that's because that's a cultural expectation and training and something they've watched maybe on television or on their screens. That comes not from a physical difference in a little girl or a little boy's body, but in our cultural expectations for them. And so, of course, there are going to be these differences. Whatever you're raised as a kid doing actually affects your body for the rest of your life. So I was, as a very young child, doing all of these very challenging, basically weightlifting exercises and strength training. And so that's now a strength that my body will have for the rest of my life. Same thing is true for any kid. So if you have a 4 or 3-year-old starting to throw a ball, that person is going to, as their body develops, their body will develop being able to throw that ball, and they'll be better at throwing a ball for the rest of their life. So when you have this differentiation in children culturally between what you teach boys and girls are really good at sort of precision things, like if you think about skipping games or balance, when there's a lot of gymnastics, dance, those kinds of things that girls are preferentially pushed towards or are interested themselves because that's what the culture tells them. Those are going to be skills that they're then going to explore and enjoy more for the rest of their lives. That's really important. And now I'll just reiterate what you said. There is physically no difference between children other than small, differences between individual kids until they get to puberty. And then we see some changes that are brought on by hormones.
So the thing that is so interesting in what you're saying and really kind of sad is that you're setting out a case in which many of the differences between the differences that we perceive between men and women are dictated more by culture than they are actually by biology. And the culture is self-reinforcing, so that if a girl is not encouraged to throw a ball, for instance, or not encouraged to lift heavy weights, because that as you just said, that sets the body up for instance, the lifetime amount of weight that it has lifted, that we're depriving them in a sort of negative reinforcement loop of ever gaining some of the abilities that they otherwise biologically are entitled to.
Yeah, and the proof of this is that we see that there are so many female athletes at the very highest levels who did have that very early impact in training. And nobody was planning this at the time. This is sort of post facto information that the exercise scientists see. Oh, why do so many of the major female soccer stars grew up playing with their older brothers or their older sisters or their older sister, their fathers, people who are really pushing them in a way that maybe a group of young little girl female players wouldn't be, or starting much earlier than other female players would have started. There's a terrible lateness of starting with female athletes, with young girls. Sometimes they don't start until right when they're in puberty or after puberty. And the boys' soccer camps and training camps for sports will start right before puberty. And training through that time of going through puberty when your body is changing, you're building those muscles and you're building those bones is incredibly important when you're talking about being the best in the world at a specific sport. Not necessarily, you can start exercising anytime during any kind of stuff you like if you're more of an amateur, but we're talking about some of the best in the world. How do you get there? You start as a kid and you start doing stuff that may be considered too hard for you.
So it's a theme throughout the book that I really found kind of sad, that that women don't know what we're capable of, both because of these cultural messages that women are, and as your title rebukes, women are the weaker sex, and your title, of course, is that women are the stronger sex. But that self-reinforcing loop prevents women from going to the limits of their physical capabilities and never really understanding what they are truly capable of. And that just seems like that's such a it's a debt that can never be paid back.
Yeah, it's definitely incredibly sobering. And I think the hopefulness is kind of realizing that. The other sort of interesting part of this is thinking about the fact that we weren't always living in this culture that expected these things from little girls' bodies or adult female bodies, to look to with such an emphasis to look a certain way. Even athletes feel a lot of pressure to look like a runner as opposed to whatever size or shape their body might be to perform the best. We see a lot of that coming up and being discussed recently, so I'm glad to see that conversation happening. But there's a deficit that occurs when you grow up in a culture that discourages basically, half or more of the different types of strength that you could possibly develop as an adult. And it is hard to ever get that back. And, doing some really great research and understanding better how hormones and all these things really work in female bodies and being able to train to those is going to help tremendously. But also changing the culture for children will generate stronger female bodies in the future. What I meant by mentioning that we haven't always been like this is that we can look back at the fossil record and see that female bodies were able to achieve levels of strength in the past with the same DNA, the same, Homo sapiens sapiens, the same human beings that we are now. We in the past were stronger. If you, again, grow up doing certain types of activities, like, for example, in the Bronze Age, bones have been found and looked at by biological anthropologists, and you can look at the bones and see how much muscle was on that bones from the attachments that are left behind on those bones in the fossil record. And one fascinating study found that, a regular woman in this Bronze Age community was about 15% stronger, had stronger upper body strength than a college rower would today. And those are the people, you think, okay, a female rower, that's kind of your like max upper body strength, unless you're a weightlifter per se. For, a regular, kind of more a regular woman, not someone who is super specialized, because these were regular women in this Bronze Age community. And just thinking about the fact this community was really into grinding grain. So they were like handling large rocks and grinding all day. And that started when you were quite young. These bodies were trained their whole lives to do this work. So that's just one example. There's many of how in the past we had different bodies as adult women because we started and lived our lives differently. So what we're experiencing now is also temporary.
So I want to remind everyone that is watching or listening that you can leave comments for us. As you can see, we've already popped some comments from people who are watching up on the screen, and we would love to hear from more of you. Just put them in the comment box or do a reply wherever it is that you're watching, and we will see them and we will lob them up. So thanks everyone for watching and commenting already. I think the thing to queue up a comment that someone else has made, because I think this is the point at which we need to talk about this. I'd like to hear you talk a bit about the range of interviewing that you did for the book and how you brought underrepresented voices into this discussion. There's several points within the book where you talk about the experiences of, as much as women generally are under researched, that the different experiences of Black women and white women, for instance, and you have a lovely discussion of where the trans and non-binary community appear in this emerging science. And I would love to hear you discuss either of those.
Yeah, so I've had two very close trans friends over the course of my lifetime, and one that was more transitory. And I don't know, but that I have always, before there was ever a conversation that was so fraught and difficult in the world about trans identity, I've known trans people and considered them friends. And so for me, including them in this book was really important because I was very concerned it not be used by people who want to push an agenda. You may know it as TERFs, but excluding trans people from conversations about women's bodies and female bodies. So two things. The first is I wasn't sure how to handle this. So as a journalist, I thought, I'm going to work on writing my book, and then I'm going to ask trans people what they think, and let them give me feedback and say what makes sense for you. What do you want to actually know as a trans person reading my book? So that included both trans men and women who were basically expert readers, and they gave me feedback of these are the questions we have. And sometimes, most of the time, there's no answers, because if there's not as much research done on female bodies, there's even less on trans bodies. But there is some, and what we learn from trans bodies, especially when you're talking about understanding hormones better, which we're just really, I feel like the next 20, 30 years is going to be like the hormone era of understanding hormones in everyone's bodies and how important they are for all different endocrine function and aging and all the things health-wise. Trans bodies can really tell scientists a lot of information about what those hormones really do and how changing hormones can affect the body and in what ways. So this is a tremendous opportunity. And the trans people who were involved in this project were also excited about that. So that's something just to mention as an exciting and positive thing. So they also said, where they flagged places like, how can I understand this better as a trans person, right? As a person who started out life with a female body or a male body and now is using these hormones, or has removed their breasts or whatever. And so in places where I answered those questions, and I asked the researchers those questions. And then in places where we don't know, I say, we don't know yet. And so I hope that was and ended up being useful to anybody who reads this book, because that's the point. I hope, even, in the non-trans or non-binary, or the binary community, people who consider themselves, I'm just a guy, I'm just a girl, that they will all be interested in reading this book, especially, guys too. So, making it inclusive includes everyone. And, hopefully, because I feel like we live in a culture where women understand so much more about male bodies and caring for them, something I've experienced in my life and among my friends, and men don't necessarily have the opposite. I think that's really changing. We've seen some great, I've seen some great online projects around that. But so I hope that, men will also be interested in reading a book about female bodies. That brings me to the last point, which is talking about female bodies versus women, right? We know there's a difference between gender and sex. Right now, in science, that verbiage is changing as scientists sort of acknowledge. But when you're talking about a book the size of this, where I'm looking at a lot of historic information, I oftentimes will use women and men because that's what the scientists at the time used, right? So if they were writing about, eggs in the female body from the 80s and 90s and even, early 2000s, they're still using women and men. That's who came into their lab. They're describing them that way. I have to describe them in that way. Where I used female bodies versus male bodies and then intersex bodies because that's more accurate scientifically. Because obviously, a trans person could have started life with a biologically female body, right? So that this is an important distinction, but I was limited and I had to also respect the way the writing had been done in the past.
So when we were talking about kids and their abilities a few minutes ago, we sort of went up to the point of puberty. And so now let's go to the far side of puberty, because I think, the historical definition or historical understanding of what constitutes a female is someone who menstruates and someone who can become pregnant. And so I'm really curious to hear, in this exploration that you made of how science is beginning to understand female bodies and female strengths differently, what did you learn about menstruation and about pregnancy that leans into this sense that women have great strengths that science hasn't understood?
There's so much more to learn. One of the only study that has been done thus far on like girls' first periods was on like 12 girls, and it was from the 80s. I mean, the lack of information is staggering. I will say there's a research project going on now that's large and well funded, looking at that question. What's normal for when a girl starts her period? What kind of hormonal changes are normal? What's abnormal? What signifies a possible problem in the future, health issue, right? These are not questions that we currently really know the answers to at all. So that's really important information. We also do know some really fascinating things about both the uterus and the ovarian system and creation of eggs that were absolutely fascinating to me. I did not know about them even before I researched this book, and I was so excited to share them because I do feel like these are strengths of the female body, not compared to male bodies, but in a completely their own category because we're talking eggs and uterus. So first, the uterus is the strongest muscle in any body, anywhere. It's stronger even than the heart. It is able to obviously push or expel a baby, and needs to be strong to be able to do that, and also rid the uterus of its menstrual lining every month, which, if you've experienced that, it can be very, very, very painful. And that's why, because it's this really strong muscle. But the uterus is actually the home of stem cells, which was only recently discovered by actually an Australian researcher, Carolyn Gargett, who basically told me that menstrual blood hadn't been looked at very closely as a human substance. People looked at mucus, people looked at saliva, people looked at urine and poop and all of the things. But not much science had been done on menstrual blood because most of the scientists were male and they thought it was gross, which is really disturbing and upsetting because it turns out that there are stem cells, like the same cells that you take very difficult process to get from bone marrow or to get from fetus remains, which was very controversial, is in every person who menstruates blood every month on the early part of your period. You can extract those stem cells, and scientists can use them for this incredibly important research that stem cells can provide. Basically, stem cells are used as a foundation for doing all kinds of research into diabetes, Alzheimer's, all kinds of diseases. But the most exciting part for me is the idea that there's a possible future where we could bank our own stem cells from our own menstrual blood for use later in life. And this is a little bit of a further off idea, but like there's cord blood banks, there may be stem cell banks one day, so that I would be able to bank my stem cells. And then if I got sick when I was older, my own stem cells could be used to help me with whatever disease issue that I have. The next part that was really exciting was learning that the egg every month when you ovulate in the middle of your cycle actually is in competition, and it's this very intense and very complicated competition. And If those who are interested should read about it. And we have this idea of the egg just kind of sitting there and waiting for sperm to come and implant into it or not.
I think we all saw those cartoons at some point in middle school.
And it's just not true. The egg is a part of an incredibly dynamic system where all the pre-eggs are basically competing with each other hormonally inside the ovary. And then they are basically having a battle. And then the main egg will kill off and take all the resources of the eggs that didn't survive that round that month and absorb them and become like the major egg that will then become
super egg.
Super egg. And it's just such an incredible story. I had no idea this was going on inside my body every month until I did this research, because I had absorbed all of those messages that we've seen. Oh, the egg is this passive creature.
So someone has just asked, have you come across studies that you feel are biased that prescribe women to be weaker as a result of all the experiences you just the lived experiences of women's lives? What do you think about the use of the term weak?
There's definitely, I think, scientists are people too, and especially, but even 10 or 15 years ago, there was scientists will go in with their hypothesis of what they expect to find. And for instance, Sandra Hunter, who's now at the University of Michigan, she early in her career, she was a postdoc. She wanted to understand strength, muscular strength between male and female bodies. And she was a scientist, but she was young, and she had a little test where you would sit in a special chair and you would lift a weight like this with your arm. And she usually the test had been done with max weights, so the maximum amount the person could lift, and then they would see how many times the person could lift, and they would do a study, and they would do various different types of movements. So she went in and wanted to ask a sort of related question about how much energy was being used, and so she lowered the weight, and she found everybody's maximum they could lift, and then she made it 50% of that. So if you're the big burly weightlifting guy and you can lift 100 pounds, she made it 50. And if you're somebody who could lift 60 pounds, she made it 30. And she wanted to see how long the people could go and how much energy they used. And so this is a very simple experiment. And she went in with the expectation that she would find, that larger muscles use more energy or whatever. But what she found was something completely different. She found that the women actually were able to persist in lifting the weights much longer in almost every case. And the more muscular men would go for 10 minutes, maybe. The women could go for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. She even had one woman be able to lift 50% of her max for an hour, which really pointed Sandra Hunter's research to, well, why is this happening? And it turns out, so this was, early in her career, she's mid-career now, that we now know that female muscles are really built for this endurance exercise. Again, not that explosive capacity, but that keep on keeping on, because we preferentially use fat to power muscular work. And so using fat, which is a long burning, more reliable and also more plentiful on female bodies resource, rather than carbs, which I should point is the other option, really gives you that long-term strength. And we see that in the real world too. It's like we're learning about this in athletics. We're now seeing all of these amazing, less trained, less funded, they've experienced less competition endurance athletes who are female winning these 100-mile races, even if there's only 3 or 4 women and there's 50 men, doing just really well. So, this has become a very sort of surprising thing in the sports world. But if you look at the world of humanity in general, you see that, women are doing the work of carrying the water. Water's heavy and unwieldy. That is a woman's job, carrying, gathering firewood, doing the long walks, carrying babies, right, in backpacks or on their hips, all of this long-term strength is inherent to and totally normal for female bodies. And so of course they're doing really well at like endurance races, right? But we had not expected to see it. Not even Sandra Hunter had expected to see that when she went in as a exercise science postdoc. So I think that's a really good example.
And what I love about that is that you reflect these current findings in this real world experience of athletes, some of whom, as you say, may be brilliant athletes, but are not getting the funding, the support, the sponsorships, and so forth. You reflect that back into prehistory as well, and pry open the myth of, the hunter-gatherers and the start of agriculture, whereas we've always sort of pictured that the men in the early tribes were out racing after the mammoths or whatever had evolved at that point, and the women are home grinding the grain. But there's fossil record to challenge that, right? That women themselves might have been out there with the spears and the clubs hauling home the game as well.
Yeah, so Carol Wall-Scheffler at Seattle Pacific University has really spearheaded some great work looking at both current hunter-gatherer communities and also the fossil record, and putting together all that information. It was a great study. Found that almost 50% of hunting is done by women. So historically and also today. Now, does that depend on the individual community? Of course. The most interesting thing about human communities that is easy to forget, or you may not have realized to begin with, is that there's so much diversity as we evolve. So every possible iteration of organizing a community has probably been done by human beings. And so, the past was very experimental. And so we see a huge diversity of remains, and there's so much more to find. And, we're going to get lots more answers to these questions, but we see women who were buried with hunting gear and were assumed to have been male bodies all these years because that was the assumption made by the person who found the body, right? In their culture, England or Germany or wherever, at that time, well, women did this and men did that, and that's all they knew. So they find a body and they assume, well, this body must be a male's. They come back later and do DNA testing, and they find that's a female body. And this has happened multiple times all over the world in various different conditions. So we have this fossil record that shows that there were lots of women hunters and celebrated women hunters. And also we have these modern hunter-gatherer communities where we see that's also the case. Now, in some cases, women may hunt differently. Women generally hunt more with dogs as assistants, which I thought was fascinating. There's like a long history of women and dogs, and that's something I actually hope to write about as a big animal person myself, who grew up with a small cadre of Dobermans. And there's the idea that's important to keep in mind, as well as the diversity thing, that human beings did what they were good at. They wouldn't have been separated out by gender or age or anything. If you were a good hunter and you were good at getting a certain type of animal, that would be the thing you would do. They weren't going to say, oh, you should sit and do basket weaving, which is actually very important, but you should do this other thing if you're good at this thing, or vice versa, just because you're a certain gender. We wouldn't have had those limitations in the past because we couldn't have afforded to waste human potential like that.
I really love, oh yeah, go ahead.
The last thing I'll say when it comes to hunting is just also hunting encompasses a whole variety of skills. So there's hunting that's like running, and chasing something down and being accurate with a spear, which is like 3 different strengths. There's also stalking, which is when you quietly watch and stalk an animal, and tracking, observational skills, being able to maintain uncomfortable body, positions, and accuracy. All of those things women's bodies are very, very good at. There's a ton of evidence, even from the modern day, that, in terms of shooting and anything where you need accurate aim, females tend to be really, really good at that. So, hunting encompasses a variety of skills, and different types of bodies, both male and female, and anyone else would have been good at some of those skills.
So I love talking about the fossil record. I love that toward the end of the book, you reclaim the myth of the Amazons, the tribe of female warriors from Greek and Central, I guess, Central Asian mythology, and show that people are finding grave sites and doing the DNA analysis to prove that, in fact, all these people buried with very elaborate sets of weapons, people whose bodies show evidence of having been in battles and been wounded and recovered, that they were actually female, and that the Amazons are not a myth. I personally love that.
That was another thing I didn't know until I read this. Of course, if you're an anthropologist, the anthropologists know this, but I'm not an anthropologist. So I was very excited to find that. And also to just see how these women were celebrated in their deaths, with these incredible tombs filled with, their war weapons. So we're talking, this is warrior stuff. So there's hunting, which we now know that women have done and still do. And there's also this warrior culture, which we are seeing that women took part in as well. And that's fascinating to me because I've definitely received those messages my whole life that these are not things that women do or did, even more so than hunting. And the level of the quality of the materials that they found in these grave sites of these female warriors is amazing. And yeah, these Amazons that were mythologized in multiple cultures. I was raised, that was just a myth. And there is actually tremendous evidence for, was really exciting and sort of wonderful to think about. And I can't wait for the Netflix show, honestly. Like, where is it?
So let's bring this up to the present day. Another commenter, someone who's watching, has asked, as you were reporting this book, what challenges did you run into? What data gaps still exist? So what do you think about the state of the science and sort of where is it going?
Yes. In fact, I got a review on Goodreads where the person said, I was frustrated by the fact that she said, well, we don't know X yet. Because I did that a few times, in the book. And I just laughed to myself because I was like, well, I'm not going to make something up. This is a science book. I have to rely on the evidence that exists so far. And there are a few places where I asked some of my scientific collaborators. I have interviewed over 40 researchers, but there's 7 or 8 that come up multiple times. And so I asked those people who were so kind with their time, what do you think is the future? And I tried to, get past some of those humps because we do have, and, there's been entire books written about the fact that we have such a lack of research into female bodies historically to today. And there's a lot of work being done to make up for that. And it's just going to take time. So there are gaps and we have to acknowledge those. And in certain cases, we can't say what the truth is. The other problem, in addition to the gaps, is what we were talking about earlier, which is that we don't know what the capacity of bodies is if we grow up in a culture where those capacities are restrained and repressed. So, you can do umpteen studies on, female calf strength, but you're never going to have an even comparison to male calf strength if those girls didn't grow up in a culture where they were doing the same types of activities as the boys when they were growing up, or the same types of activities as adults. You see, we tend to segregate ourselves into, women are doing Pilates and yoga, and men are doing, more tend to do more sports and more weightlifting. Even now, I'm a weightlifter. I'm so happy to see, so many more women doing that, but it's still a heavily male dominated field, despite all the argument, all the articles and the books out there, which is wonderful. When you go to the gym and you are lifting the weights, it's still mostly guys. So I think that, you have the actual, because we're talking about bodies, you have your actual physical limitations that scientists face, which is like, I have to look at a scale of bodies here that grew up in the real world that we all did. And that's a limitation. And then the history, the long-term history, you have to go back in some cases, like Carolyn Duncombe at the University of Washington. she looks at immune system function, and she was sort of highlighted in my immunity chapter. She had to go back and do some basic science around hormones and immunity to answer one of her questions, because she's up here trying to answer this question about malaria and finding, cures for these diseases, and how different types of vaccines work in different in male and female bodies, which we mentioned earlier why that would be. But then she realized there wasn't the basic science, which is the early building blocks of understanding how those hormones worked, to answer, so that she could ask her question up here. So she had to go back and spend like a year of her time to answer this question first, which is very important for all the other researchers after her, of course, but she then got stalled. Then she went back and was able to answer the other question. But scientists encounter that kind of thing all the time when you're looking at sex difference in any type of health, because sometimes the information, all the history that you're basing your science on has been done on male bodies, and you're like, wait a minute, now I have to go back. So those are two of the challenges. I think there's a lot happening right now in terms of understanding how knowing more about female bodies help all bodies, like the stem cell example, right? So stem cells and the research that comes from them benefits everyone. But, we now have a greater supply of them because they're easily accessible from menstrual blood. So the more we know about female bodies, the more we'll be able to make better science for everyone.
So you just mentioned that you're a weightlifter. This is going to be my last question. So to close us out, I love the anecdote toward the end of the book where you go to a bar on Okinawa, and it's owned by an unthinkably old woman whom you take to be about 30 years younger than her actual age. And in Okinawa, a blue zone, there are a number of social conditions and things that people do personally that make them more likely to live a long time, and the women are living longer than men. So what the last question I want to ask you is, out of all this research you did for the book, how is it reflected back in your own life? That it hasn't, I'm imagining it hasn't only taught you that your earliest lessons about being a strong, independent being were valid, but there must be things that you're taking forward into the future as well.
For sure. Definitely the strength training is a huge one, because it's so beneficial for hormones, for bones, for muscles, for just feeling really good and empowered. My aunt started weightlifting before me to deal with her osteoporosis, because you can grow bone at any age, which is wonderful, but you can grow bone more easily before you go through menopause. So I'm trying to get my bones as strong as possible, because osteoporosis does run in my family. So that's a huge one. But the thing that my aunt said that I found to be true as well is lifting weights just makes you feel like so good in the world, just walking around, like capable and able. And that's a wonderful feeling to achieve, especially in a culture that assumes that you can't pick up and move those two chairs without someone else's help, right? The other thing I would say is that I'm really focused on thinking about the long-term health. They call it health span. You've, I'm sure, heard of this, rather than just lifespan. Women's health span, which is the number of years that you're healthy and can enjoy life, is actually smaller than men's, even though women live longer, right? And I see this in my own family of the oldest generation, who didn't exercise, smoked and drank, and definitely had a fun time when they were younger, but really are living a very long time, but, dealing with multiple health issues. And some of that stuff is not avoidable and is genetics, right? But some of that is down to lifestyle. And so for what I'm looking at is trying to think about my health span. I want to have as many healthy years as I can as a person who enjoys being independent and running around the world. So I'm looking at, all of the things that go into that and the research behind that, not just living to be 95, but hopefully living to be at least 90 and feeling really good. And that is something that Kamiko taught me in Okinawa. They walk and move a lot, and historically we're carrying a lot of stuff, as women do, which is great for bones and muscles. And so she told me a lot about growing up. They'd actually lived through World War II. They're that old to meet people who lived through World War II. And the way they see the world is also very community oriented, and they spend a lot of time with their friends. Even though they're in a bar drinking alcohol, they didn't drink very much alcohol, I will say. It was very, very moderate. It was more about being there with friends. It was about singing songs that they knew from their youth. It was about telling jokes and being really silly. These 90-something-year-old women were extremely funny and silly with each other. They'd known each other forever. And that was so beautiful to see and be around. And that's something that I want to experience when I'm that age too.
It's just such a lovely anecdote, and it's such a great place to end. Starre, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really fascinating. I think that our viewers and listeners really responded to it as well. I'm so grateful you came on.
Thank you so much, Maryn. I appreciate it.
So that's it for this installment of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series. Please consider following Starre on social media. She has accounts on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky, and please buy the book. It's available at her publisher, Seal Press, which is part of Hachette, an imprint of Hachette, at Amazon, of course. But we like to recommend the anti-Amazon bookshop.org. It's a platform that funnels orders to independent bookstores, and you can find the book there as well. Now, please join us next month on November 19th to hear from Aram Alam with The Care of Foreigners, How Immigrant Physicians Changed U.S. Healthcare, just published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And please visit our RSVP page to sign up in advance for that live stream. Until next time, I hope we see you then. I'm Maryn McKenna. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University, the Georgia Center for the Book, Emory's Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement, and Ideas Festival Emory, and from me, thank you for watching. See you next month.